Thank you all for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's kind of like a homecoming celebration of sorts. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Eric Kleinberg. I'm a sociologist and the director of the Institute for Public Knowledge, which is where you're sitting. Right now, we do lots of research projects that span a range of issues that the university covers, from climate change to democracy, and have lots of working groups that also bring together faculty and students from every part of the university: engineering, law, medicine, public policy, social science, education. It's really a vibrant and exciting place to work. One of our favorite things to do here is to bring in authors for conversations about their new works. And one of our extra favorite things to do is to bring back former colleagues who deserted us wrongly, and who were prize members of the community and went on to greater things. So Dalton Conley, special person around here. One of the big reasons I came to New York myself, to NYU, longer ago than I care to confess. He was a university professor here. He was the dean of the social sciences for several years. And Dalton, for those of you who know him, has this completely distinctive, original, restless mind. And you get kind of a little biography or autobiography in this book, which is kind of weaves together some science with some memoir in typical Dalton Conley style. But at some point, I remember Dalton getting frustrated with the answers that sociology was giving him, and really with the techniques for doing knowledge production that he was getting from sociology. And so there was a flirtation with economics for a little while. Remember that flirtation with economics? And then that ended, and another direction altogether emerged, which is that Dalton was going to get a PhD in biology, which he did. For a while, he referred to himself as a sociobiologist, and now social genomics. So this new book just came out a few weeks ago, The Social Genome, the new science of nature and nurture. And without giving away the big story, essentially what he's trying to do is explode this distinction and say it makes no sense to think of nature versus nurture. They're intertwined. The environment is in the gene is in the environment. We need a new vocabulary, and we need a new scientific technique for understanding why a whole range of outcomes that we have simplified in the past. It's a really challenging argument. You don't read a lot of books that start with 30 or 40 pages saying, I'm not doing this, and don't worry about the history of this. Like, we can do better, because Dalton knows that this is really dangerous territory, and that arguments like this get misused throughout history, and he's really trying to do everything possible to make sure that this set of ideas doesn't get misused in the way that we've seen ideas used in the past. So I'm sure he's going to talk about that. When Dalton finishes speaking, I'm going to bring out my relatively new colleague at NYU, Byungkyu Lee, who is kind of like Dalton, intellectually restless and curious, working on everything from social networks to health to some biosociology, sociobiology, and sociogenomics too. So BK has a few comments, and then we're going to have the two of them jump into conversation. We'll then bring in everybody for typical questions. And as always, the only request here at IPK when you come for the evening is that you not force the bookseller to carry a giant box of books home. I know that Dalton will be thrilled to sign books afterwards, so stick around. Dalton, the floor is yours. Welcome back.
You're doing such a good job describing the book. I was going to say, you can do the talk, keep going.
I'm ready. But you can do the talk, but there is actually no microphone there. So
there is no.
Yeah, it doesn't work. So
it's just psychological.
It's just there for, you gotta be loud.
Okay. Since I'm hearing impaired, I think I'm naturally loud. So can you hear me in the back? Yeah. So this is really great to be here with so many former colleagues that I've missed. So I'm going to start actually with a little bit of a social science story, since there's so many sociologists here. At my heart in my career, I try to study what's called social stratification. We have Mike Howard in the audience, one of the deans of that school of inquiry, and that's basically how, I think your first book was entitled Following Father's Footsteps, right? Something I might be misread the title. And it's basically about how social status, in that case, in Mike's case, measured by occupation, but measured anyway, is transmitted between parents and children, and how much, not just how much inequality is there in a given society, but what's the process by which people either are upwardly, downwardly mobile or reproduce their parents' social status. That's how I was trained. I was firmly in that school of thought, and as I was working on my dissertation, turning that into a book, which was about the role of family wealth as opposed to income or occupation in the class transmission process from parents to children. I read another book by a heterodox sociologist named Susan Mayer, who was a longtime dean of the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And Susan Mayer was a Sandy Jenks student, those of you who know that lineage. The title of her book was What Money Can't Buy, Family Income and Children's Life Chances. And in the book, she argued that what people like I was doing, and many people in our community was doing, which would basically compare people at different, with parents at different occupation levels or income levels, or in my case, wealth levels, and see how the kids turned out, and conclude that, well, look, people who have more money, more income, the kids do better on test scores, they do better on health, they do better on ultimately what job they land and so forth, and therefore we should support income redistribution because Jeff Bezos' kids don't need another dollar, but a lot of other kids need another dollar, and that will help. But she said, wait a minute, the same traits that produce income for parents in labor market returns are probably also helping the kids independent of the income itself. So in other words, she was saying that income is just a proxy for something about families that benefits kids. And the actual effect of an additional dollar of income was probably marginal at best. And she did this by showing that, like, if you compare income from different sources, like if you look at income people earn in the labor market, there's a big effect. But if you look at an inheritance or any other kind of windfall, there's basically no effect. She showed that the income, like 5 years after you measure the kids' outcomes, just as well as the income measured 5 years before the outcomes, suggesting that, well, the future can't predict the past of what's going on here. She did a whole other bag of tricks to cast doubt on what the field had been saying is the power of family income on kids. And that kind of like shook me up greatly, that book. At one point, a few years later, she was giving a talk, a keynote, and I kind of bum rushed her after the show and said, well, what is it that you think income is acting as a proxy for? Like, it's got to be culture, or it's got to be genes. Well, which is it? Which is it? I was like hyper aggressive, and she was like, well, I don't really get into that. We don't have the research for that or whatever. She was very polite. She was a dean. She was very slick, and unlike how I was. Anyway, but it nagged at me. And then simultaneously, I read this adjacent literature called behavioral genetics, which is kind of a bastard stepchild of psychology. And in that, the sort of bread and butter of that discipline or subdiscipline is a twin study. Even though you've probably all seen Three Identical Strangers, if you haven't, you should see that, about these three identical triplets raised in very different socioeconomic strata. That's not how most twin studies work. Most twin studies actually look at twins that are raised together in a household, but they just compare how alike are identical twins, same-sex identical, obviously same-sex identical twins, to same-sex fraternal twins. And how much more alike the identical twins are than the fraternal twins gives us an indicator of how much something is genetic, and then you can figure out how much is environment, and you can further subdivide the environment into the shared environment of the fraternal twins and the unshared environment. And 50 years of research that conducted using this twin methodology, which has its issues we could get into in the Q&A if you want, but I've come down on the side that is probably accurate. Is about 50% is genetic across all, like that's the median across literally thousands of traits. Some traits like personality are like on the lower end genetic, maybe 20%. Some traits like height are at the upper end, like close to 90% genetic. But most of them are in the middle somewhere. But the more astonishing finding from all that research for sociologists, I think, was that the common family environment explained almost nothing. So if you take those two facts together, then when parents and children look the same, whether they're following their father's footsteps occupationally, or they have the same personality quirks or cultural predilections or what have you, that's mostly due to their genes. And when they look different, when siblings look different or children are different from their parents, that's due to the environment. So I think that we sociologists have been having it all asked backward, if you forgive the expression, that we've been thinking that when we see similarity in families, that's really due to the socialization in the family. And it turns out, I think the evidence is that it's genetics that create that similarity. And when we see difference in families, between family members, then that's the environment rearing its head. Happy to get into debate about that after, but we've had 50 years of twin studies. That's all well and nice, but that's kind of like looking at the shadows in the wall in Plato's allegory of the cave, because you can't really actually directly measure genes or the environment. You're just inferring the kind of relative impact. But then in 2003, the draft human genome sequence was released. Geneticists were really excited, even though they were really wrong about how many genes humans had. There was a betting pool at Cold Spring Harbor, and I think the lowest guess was 80,000 genes, because something like rice, those of you who participated in the trivia game a couple weeks ago know this, has 144,000 genes, but humans only had less than 20,000 genes. So that was the first thing they were wrong about. How many genes you have doesn't correspond to how complex an organism is. Second thing they were wrong about was they thought that when they had decoded this so-called book of life, in the words of James Watson, it would be a few short years before they would discover the 5 or so genes behind heart disease, the 10 or so implicated in schizophrenia, the dozen in arthritis, and maybe even the 20 involved in cognitive ability. And then we would, the big pharma would come to the rescue and make drugs that either block or enhance those proteins, and we would solve a lot of chronic diseases. And GLP-1 agonists aside, which is like the exception to the rule here, we have not had this kind of pharmacogenomics revolution that has cured disease. Instead, we found out that almost every outcome we care about is highly polygenic. And what I mean by polygenic is that they're influenced by thousands of little differences across all of our 23 pairs of chromosomes. You've probably very often heard the term that we're all 99.9% genetically identical. Where that idea comes from is that only in about 1 out of every 1,000 base pairs there's a variant. There's variation, common variation in the population. But even though sort of the biotech despaired about the fact that you can't develop a drug that's supposed to kind of mimic 2,000 locations in the genome to address someone's arthritis. But you can take those 2,000 locations in the genome that have been discovered to have effects on likelihood of arthritis and sum them into a single number called a polygenic score, polygenic index, there's a polygenic risk score, there's a genomic risk score, there's a bunch of terms for it. I use polygenic index for some reasons I can get into in the Q&A if you're interested. Anyway, I call this polygenic index the FICO score of human biology. And I should say scores because you have one for each outcome. You have one for predicting how tall or short you're going to be, one for predicting the likelihood of coronary artery disease, and you have one to predict how far you're going to go in school. So in the last iteration, the one for educational attainment, as we call it, if you're in the top decile, you have, on average, a 71% chance of graduating with a four-year college degree. But if you're in the bottom decile, you have a 7% chance of graduating with a four-year college degree. So the R squared, for those of you who follow this, is less than 20%. So it's not, in other words, explaining only 20% of the variation in outcomes. So it's not at all some sort of genie in a bottle. But that's a pretty stark difference between the top 10th percentile and the bottom 10th percentile. Because these scores predict, but they can't help us with sort of solving the biology of all of these outcomes. They've been more of a boon to social scientists, I would argue, than they are in the clinical setting. There are a few exceptions, like the polygenic score for heart disease. The National Health System in the UK, for example, uses that to screen people very young for possible development of heart disease and start people even in their 20s on statins. But that's one of the rare uses of the polygenic index for clinical purposes. Instead, I think I show in this book, they're very useful for understanding social dynamics. And they raise important ethical and policy conundra that we should address as social scientists. So because genes don't change in you, because they're fixed the moment you're conceived, we can use your genome to follow how you interact in the world. Meaning, if I take, if BK has a high polygenic index for smoking, and we observe that people around him, like Eric, tend to take up smoking, we know that it's not Eric's behavior affecting BK's genome. We know that causation must go through BK to Eric because his genome cannot change. So it solves that kind of causal inference problem. So it allows us, for example, to look at inside a family. And we can see that, for example, even from 18 months old, a child with a high polygenic index for education, conditional on the parent's average, receives different parenting than the kid, hypothetical kid with a lower polygenic index. So this is randomly, like if Eric and I somehow had a baby, and we're both at the 50th percentile for educational attainment, we could get a 40th percentile kid or a 60th percentile kid. Without even knowing that information, that kid, we don't know it, the kid doesn't know it, they're going to guide us to actually parent them differently. We're going to spend more time reading to the kid with a higher polygenic index. We're going to spend more time verbally engaged and play with them. Unbeknownst, before we are getting report cards or reports from the pediatrician. Interestingly, as any parent of teenagers knows, when you get to adolescence, work by a couple of Spanish economists showed that flips. The higher polygenic index kid gets ignored by their parents, and the lower polygenic index kid gets additional attention. The straight A student you just leave alone to do their thing. The kid who's like on the risk of flunking out, your kid, then that's the one who gets all your attention then. So But this is an example of the social genome, how the genes of others are influencing our behavior, which is what a lot of what the book talks about. I don't want to take too much longer because I think it's more fun to have a discussion. I'm very looking forward to what hearing what BK says, but I just want to raise one more issue about what are the policy implications of this this FICO score for human biology. There's some immediate policy decisions that have to be made. Many of you might have seen the New York Times special on the polygenically selected babies that ran a couple weeks ago. These babies are being born now that have been where their embryos have been tested. They'll say you get a dozen embryos from an IVF cycle, and you take a sample of each of their DNA, and then the parent presented with the polygenic scores on various traits for those embryos and decided which to implant. And people are doing this now. The first baby, Aurora, was born in 2020, and there's been a lot more since then. So is that something we want to regulate in the United States? The United States is a wild west when it comes to fertility medicine. In France, you can't even pick the sex of your offspring through IVF, but here you can do anything. In fact, there was a lab a while ago that stopped this, but was offering polygenic scores on physical traits like height and skin tone. What happens when insurance companies or even schools, private schools, wanting a swab of your cheek before they set the premiums or decide whether your 4-year-old is worthy of attending the Horace Mann or Dalton School on the Upper East Side? And insurance companies right now, health insurance is banned from using DNA by the 2008 Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, and employers are banned from using it, but that leaves, as I mentioned, schools, long-term care insurance, life insurance, car insurance, a whole range of domains. It's not so simple just to expand GINA to say, okay, well, let's not have any insurance companies be able to use your DNA to reject you as a policy seeker or to set premiums, because a record number of Americans now have their own DNA through the now bankrupt 23andMe or Ancestry.com or some other services, and it's very easy to basically right-click and download your raw data and then upload it to another server and get your own polygenic scores or indices. And if you see that you have a high likelihood of dementia, let's say, you might buy long-term care insurance, and someone else who thinks they have a low polygenic score for dementia might not. And if you have that kind of adverse selection in an insurance market, it'll collapse. So simply banning the insurance companies doesn't solve the whole problem. A lot more exciting issues we could talk about. There's a sort of mating going on at the genetic level. Your spouse is probably the genetic equivalent of your first cousin once removed, as icky as that might sound to you. We can trace sort of the great polarization, the great sort in America that's not happening just socially, it was happening genetically too. But I will stop there, and hopefully we can discuss some of these issues in the Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I want to start by thanking Eric and Michael for putting together this wonderful event, and they're providing this fantastic book. It's truly an honor to discuss Dalton's book, in part because Dalton has been my mentor and giving me advice and support whenever I need it. Now it's time to pay back. The only way I know how is by offering harsh critique. So after all, the sharpest kind of cuts come from the inside. According to Dalton, all of sociology boils down to two big questions. How do groups hold together? And what makes groups unequal? Dalton is interested in the second, inequality. and I'm interested in the first, social cohesion, how social networks form and how people stay connected. In my view, the social genome is deeply about actually social connections, specifically about how social context and relationships shapes us, and Dalton is looking at this through the lens of genetics. So the book is not only about how genes matters for inequality, but also about how genes matter for social connections and how genes matter through social relationships. The book is very dense, but surprisingly easy and fun to read. Dalton mixes rigorous social science studies with animal experiments, personal stories, and historical examples, making complicated science feel close to home. Honestly, I read it in one setting, which almost never happens to me before. So it was really good. Now the book actually tackles nature and nurture. More importantly, how the two blend together. After Dalton wrote an op-ed in the New York Times based on his book, some people in the comment section actually complained that we already know nurture and nature interact, and what's new? I'm pretty sure that they didn't read the book. Because Dalton's real claim is much, much deeper. It is not simply that nature and nurture interact, but this is the first dichotomy to separate nature and nurture in the first place. To demonstrate this main point, he first worked through traditional and recent studies on the role of genetics. Twin studies show almost all traits are heritable, meaning genes matters. Further, recent genetic studies actually based on GWAS, like genome-wide association studies, link DNA to education, income, even happiness. One of the recent examples is an argument made by Catherine Page Harden in her book, The Genetic Lottery, Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. She claims that genes have a causal influence on education achievement, suggesting a new foundation for understanding inequality. Even though she carefully framed it as a genetic lottery and luck, the implication of the argument assumes a little bit of a genetic determinism and emphasizes the importance of the nature. But Dalton's book challenges this idea. He claims that genetic influence might not be purely nature. Actually, the way genes shape individuals in inequality could be through genetic nurture. Here's an example. Imagine a child whose parents' genes predispose them to high educational level. Even if the child doesn't inherit those exact genes, the environment created by the parents, like the books, conversations, and expectations, profoundly shapes the child's outcome. Similarly, genetic sorting is another mechanism. Here, your own genes shape the environment you move into, the friends you make, the neighborhood you live in, and the countries you actually migrate into. Therefore, throughout the genetic nurture and genetic sorting, the genetic effects on education achievement may work through nurture, which is induced by the genetics. On the flip side, what we think as an environment, as a purely nurture, is also tangled with the genes. For example, your school environment isn't randomly assigned. It is often a product of the parents' resources and choices, which also correlate with the genetics. In short, what we thought was a nature might be nurture, and vice versa. So this leads to us a powerful question: what does it even mean to ask how much a trait is due to gene versus the environment? For example, even if 90% of a trait variation is genetic, that doesn't mean that gene determines the outcome. On the other hand, even if only 10% is genetic, that doesn't mean that genes are irrelevant. Going further, Dalton critically evaluated how most studies examine gene-environment interactions, showing that without considering this genetic nurture and sorting, these models could generate misleading results because of lack of exogeneity in environmental variations and potential gene-to-gene interactions given the genetic sorting. In addition, Dalton highlights a surprising pattern. Everything is heritable, but shared family environments seem to matter less than external environments and pure luck. This points to a big role of random events and social shock, things that you can predict or plan for. And then Dalton introduced the brilliant concept of the social genome, which indicates genes that are not your own could matter as an external environment that shapes your behavior. To support this fascinating idea, he presents his research that shows your spouse genes can shape your mental health more than your own genes. Or your school grade mates' genes can influence your smoking behavior than your own genes. So these findings are really fascinating, and we are shaped not by our own DNA, but by the collective genetics of the people around us. This insight pushes us to rethink social environment. Maybe it's not your friend's behavior that matters. Maybe it's your friend's genetic predispositions pulling together, subtly shaping outcomes. So there are actually many more subtle and interesting arguments in the book, but for me, a big message is very clear. Nature and nurture cannot be separated. We need to rethink genetic influence. It is not simply that genes cause individual behaviors and outcomes. If genes matter, then it should matter through the environments that we belong to, indirectly through other people and other genes. As someone who studies social networks, I found these ideas genuinely surprising and fascinating. I hope that more people use powerful genetic tools to study how genes, social networks, and social environment shape each other. So it's now time for critique. Reading this book, actually I have 4 big questions that stuck with me. I love to hear everyone's actually thought on this. First question, what does it really mean to treat genes as a predictive tool? The first Dalton shows that polygenic indices, like the PGIs, involve many genes, each with tiny effects. So it is not a simple bad gene, good gene story. Plus PGIs are probabilistic, not deterministic. They predict group trends, not individual destinies. Even so, Dalton suggests that PGIs could be used for personalized education or medicine. I love this idea, seeing PGIs as not as a destiny, but as a tool for better tailoring interventions. But here's the puzzle. On the one hand, if PGIs aren't reliable for individuals, how can you use them in individualized treatments or personalized educations? Isn't it too noisy for us to rely on these as useful markers? On the other hand, if we do use these actually kind of PGI scores because of their high predictive accuracy, how do we prevent from people treating PGIs like a genetic report card, relating to stigma or discriminations? So here's one example that illustrates this tension. Imagine a future where school counselors and teachers look at child's PGI for education. Perhaps students may be asking each other's PGI for education. And how do you prevent biases, stigma, discrimination if the score looks low, for example? As sample size grows, I expect that PGIs for various traits will become even more predictive in the future. One day, PGIs might feel as rare and powerful as a cholesterol test or BMI. So now it is urgent to ask how we can actually handle that moment. The second question, what does it mean for sociology that genes actually shape environments? Dalton shows that genetic influences can shape individual outcomes as well as the environment that we encounter. And now we have these genetic data in many surveys and population studies. On the one hand, this is very exciting because now we can control for this kind of genetic propensity to get a causal effects of certain environment that we care about. On the other hand, but for sociologists who care about the mechanisms about how social connections happen at the major level processes, it raises some interesting theoretical questions. Right now, we don't see each other's DNA. Instead, we react to the phenotypes, traits like looks, speeches, or behaviors. As Jeremy Fries in AJS earlier has argued, if we are focused on social consequences, maybe we don't need to actually worry too much about these invisible genes because we can observe that traits that matter. Still, I wonder, how should we think about social processes if people are indirectly influencing each other through these unseen genetic factors? What does it mean that my friend's genes affect me through the things that I'm not aware of? I think that this is really a fascinating question. I'm particularly interested in the possibility that one of the mechanisms by which these social genomes shape individual outcome might be culture. By systematically studying and characterizing how the distribution of genetic predispositions differ across classrooms, schools, and communities, we can better understand the meaning and impact of this social genome. My third question is, where does actually epigenetics actually fit into this story? This book focuses on genetic and the environment interplay, but we know that social factors like stress and trauma can literally modify how genes are expressed through epigenetic changes. In other words, nurture can rewrite the nature. For example, I'm working on a project where I have measures of people's personal networks and epigenetic data. And I found that having hasslers who makes your life difficult is associated with the accelerated biological aging, which you measure using second and third generation epigenetic clocks. In other words, hasslers in your life could make you biologically older. Of course, this association cannot be considered as being causal, but still it shows a possibility that our social environment may also shape the expression of genes. How might epigenetics complicate or enrich the idea of the social genome? For instance, could your spouse's stressful life event not only affect your behavior, but also your gene expression over time? I don't expect Dalton to cover everything in this book. This book is already has a lot of things. But I would love to hear more about how you see epigenetics actually fitting in. And one last question. How do you address the disturbing trends of genetic stratification and genetic sorting in American society? In the book, Dalton presents two deeply unsettling trends. First, genetic sorting. The extent to which people with similar genes cluster together has been increasing over time in the United States. You see it marriage patterns, you see it in a geography. People are increasingly sorting themselves genetically, and even if they don't realize it. Second, genetic stratification. The extent to which genes predict socioeconomic status has also increased. Not uniformly across all traits, but the general pattern is kind of clear. These two forces, sorting and stratification, reinforces each other. Together, they suggest that we face growing genetic inequality. Some might argue that maximizing genetic influences actually create a true meritocracy. Others, myself and Dalton included, worry that it edges dangerously close to genetic determinisms. And that's a kind of the frightening thought. Nevertheless, Dalton's findings imply that American society could face a rising threat to social cohesion and social inequality due to this increasing genetic stratification and sorting. Earlier in the book, Dalton framed sociology around two big questions. How do groups hold together, and what makes groups unequal? The issue sits at the intersection of both. Dalton proposed some important policy responses, like strengthening safety nets, providing better information about genetic potential, and using this information wisely. But personally, I feel that this solution might not be enough. It seems to me that genetic sorting and inequality are accelerating, fueled not only by existing social trends, but also by forces like political polarization and the rise of AI-driven stratifications. So this leaves me wondering what other measures could we take to counteract the genetic stratification and protect social cohesion. So the book raised that question for me, and I'm still searching for answers that fully address the scale of this challenge. So wrap up, as I said in the beginning, I'm deeply fascinated by this book. Dalton's argument that the nature versus nurture debate is a wrong question is a real breakthrough. The social genome opens new lenses, new methods, and new ways of thinking about how humans are shaped. Instead of closing the conversation, this book actually opens a whole new field of inquiry. So I look forward to discussing these ideas.
I mean, you shouldn't have taught him so well. I think you're screwed.
I don't think we're going to respond to all of it. Very good points. I will just briefly talk about epigenetics. Social scientists generally don't like
what I do, where genes or biology are on the right-hand side of the equation, predicting some social outcome, because it gets us, as mentioned in the intro, sort of echoes of genetic determinism, eugenics, etc., of the past, even though I think that today's scientists come up at it from a very different perspective. But social scientists do love epigenetics, which is because it switches that and it says, look, the social environment is so damn powerful that it literally rewires your DNA. Like it attaches these chemical methyl groups in this case, but there's other epigenetic modifications to your DNA to switch certain genes on or off. And look how powerful the social environment is. And take that, genes. And moreover, the real extreme version of epigenetics in social sciences is that those epigenetic marks or signatures could be inherited. Meaning, let's say your grandparents were Holocaust survivors, or you could trace 3 or 4 generations back to ancestors who were enslaved. The trauma of that actually, through the stress, for sure, kind of affected their epigenome, that affected their gene expression. But is it inherited to 3 generations or 4 generations later, or even just one generation later? That is like a very mind-blowing concept in itself. That we can't almost. To me, I find it kind of depressing that we can't sort of leave. Generation is not a fresh start. Like, we are going to carry around these traumas from generations past. I think that, so the first version of epigenetics, I'm totally on board with. We know that the environmental experiences affect how our genome is expressed. That's a major mechanism. So I kind of don't deal with it in the book because it's just sort of a in-between step from social environment to genome to, or I should say, social environment and the genetic predisposition to epigenome to behavior or outcomes. And I kind of don't talk about that step much, but it's there. So I don't. The second, more bolder claim about epigenetics that we inherit that is very much more controversial, and that's because every cell in your body has the exact same, unless you have cancer, has the exact same genetic blueprint. But what makes one cell a liver cell, another cell, an astrocyte, another cell, an epithelial skin cell, all of that from the same blueprint is because of epigenetic marks. But it all started with one cell, the zygote, the fertilized egg. And the theory is that all those epigenetic marks are wiped clean when that fertilization happens, so that that cell can become any type of cell. So there's got to be some parallel memory to say, oh yeah, your dad was a Holocaust survivor, so we got to reinstate some. We got to remember that somehow and pass it on to the egg, so that when it's dividing and forming different types of cells, that trauma is remembered and reattached. That's a big. We don't know that. There's evidence in animals where you can do experiments, but it's going to be a long time before we have any real human evidence, because I thought about what kind of experimental design it would take, natural experiment it would take, but it's going to be very hard. There's too many other cultural narratives and so forth. So that's epigenetics. And the other issue, like genetic sorting and stratification, that we're becoming more unequal genetically as we are becoming more unequal socially. That's a big problem. I don't have the answer to that. But if you look at data in the UK, the people who remain in those sort of depressed coal mining towns in northern England look genetically very different than the people who left or empty now. And that's happening in the United States too. When we talk about these sort of kind of dying towns or small industrial cities in the Midwest, there's essentially a drain the more advantaged people health-wise and so forth, leaving those places. So sort of the rural deaths of despair kind of epidemic in the United States. I don't know if it's as easily solvable as, you know, a tax break to try to stimulate jobs there or something. We're separated on a much deeper level. And we can see that in marriage patterns, as I mentioned. We can see that in friendship patterns. We can see that in where people live and in all scales of society. So those are 2 of your 4 things, but I'll leave it at that.
Do you want to handle your own questions, or you want me to do it for you? I can handle it for you. All right. Floor is open.
So, as you know, I'm a big fan of the pecking order, and what it caused me to do was reflect in a lot of ways. But this finding that the family effect is small actually was already present in that one, and it sounds like the literature has continued to grow, the evidence base has continued to grow, but it was the Germany argument was already there. And it caused me to reflect on family background, since it is my stock and trade. But also as a father of 3 kids, I called to mind Sunday dinner. And Sunday dinner was really important in our family because we noticed that it was really rare that the 5 of us were together. And so my policy intervention was to mandate Sunday dinner. And so that then was a long, you give us stories, I have to give stories back. The kernel, though, is that maybe it's a fiction that the family is a fixed background. That day-to-day, hour-to-hour, different people are assembled there, and several hours a day, nobody's at home. And so maybe that's the source of the surprising finding or the minuscule impact of families, is in fact that we have reified composition into the moment-to-moment composition. And in fact, the environmental flux there is bigger than maybe even at the office or in the school classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up, even if you are a full sibling, spaced not that far apart from your brother or sister, you are going to have a very different experience with the family, and that counts as what I'm calling non-shared environment. So even though it is the family, to the extent that that different experience is caused by your genes, by the fact that you were the brainy one and your brother was the sporty one, and so you were treated differently in the household, you were brought to different extracurricular activities or encouraged in different ways, that goes into the genetics bucket because it's starting from your genes. But to the extent that either you got a different, a inspiring teacher or coach that sent you on that pathway, and your parents reinforced it, that goes into the, even though your parents are playing a big role, that goes into the non-shared environment bucket, or the extent to which, when you were born, it was a recession, and when your brother was born, it was good times, or when you were about to go to college, when you were graduating high school, that there was a stark economic difference. That, even though it's the same family, that goes into in this accounting scheme. That goes into the bucket of non-shared environment, even though you're right, they're both happening within the household and within the family. So that's a good sort of clarifying point. Yeah, there's lots of differences. Just some of them are originating from the child's genetics. Some of them are originating from the changes in the family environment and the dynamic aspects of the family. So maybe it's not that surprising that when we talk about what is exactly shared, it's very little. My colleagues, Matt Salganic, ran a big study based on the Netflix challenge. The Netflix challenge was Netflix gave users or teams, scientific teams, a bunch of data on people's ratings ratings of movies and their preferences and what movies they chose after watching a different one. And they said, develop an algorithm for predicting what movies people are going to like. He took that. He said, well, if they can, data science can do that for a for-profit company trying to maximize revenue. Why can't we do that for predicting how kids turn out? And so he had the Fragile Families Challenge, and he got these data that are based in Princeton, and teams came from all around to try to predict how kids would turn out at age 15 based on data from 0 to 9, and they failed spectacularly, in his words, because they predicted very poorly. And I said, well, that wasn't a surprise to me because, well, number one, you didn't mention it. You didn't measure the genes, which actually had genetic data. But more importantly, we designed surveys around the question, asking questions about what's the same about households, not about what's different. And I think it means we have to rethink how we do actually traditional survey research too, what questions we ask to capture that dynamism you're talking about.
Okay, let's do Rich.
Thank you, Dalton. I haven't read it yet. I can't wait to read it. And so I don't know the extent to which the book addresses this, but the question, two concise questions. The first is, what you in the book are making with this new frontier to solve things medically through gene editing, and this idea that Genentech, for example, they're doing this atlas at the cellular level even, and saying that if you're genetically predisposed to have XYZ type of cancer, what interventions and prophylactics and vaccines could you use? So it's just a general question on what you're thinking about this new frontier, what implications it would have, the curative, gene therapy and as a big business. And the second question is just even simpler, is if you took a society like Iceland, which presumably might be more genetically and socially and culturally homogenous, does that change anything you find?
Okay, the first one, we have a lot of public discussion about CRISPR, that very exciting gene editing software, if you will, and that is going to, has already revolutionized agriculture. Doing gene editing in a targeted way, reduce the need for pesticides and other things. It's cured sickle cell anemia in some cases, and other single gene diseases. But what people are really worried about, excited about, both are what's called germline gene editing, where if I am recessive for Tay-Sachs or something, let's say, they can go in and edit the embryos and edit that mutation out, and not only cure it for that child, but basically for all the descendants, and get rid of that mutation. I think that's notwithstanding the twin babies born in China in 2018 that had their CD6 receptors edited out so they could not contract AIDS. Notwithstanding that case, I don't think that's going to be a common procedure anytime soon, and that's because it's just, first of all, the realization that there's thousands of locations across the genome for most things we care about. That means you can't design CRISPR for 10,000 locations. And second, those locations are really just proxies. They're kind of, this is getting pretty technical, but these markers pick up a chunk of your chromosome. And it could be anywhere in that chunk where the actual kind of gene, the actual variation you need to change is, but we don't know where those actual, what we call causal variants are. And thirdly, it's much easier just to select embryos than it is to modify them. It's much less dangerous. And the only case you could think of that where you would actually need CRISPR in gene modification would be like, imagine two people with Huntington's having a baby. Actually, that's dominant if I remember correctly. So you could still use gene selection, but two people with a recessive gene
I think Tay-Sachs was recessive. So you have 2 people with Tay-Sachs wanting to have a baby. There's no embryos that would come out that would not have the disease, so you have to edit them. But that's like 1 in, just statistically, would be like 1 in 6 million people or something like that. So it's just not necessary. It would be much easier to just screen embryos and not for diseases. I forgot your second question.
Iceland.
Oh, Iceland. In Iceland, yeah, it's very homogeneous. It's a founder population, and which means that genetic variation was very contracted, and people, there's not a lot of in-migration, so they've been reproducing with each other. And in fact, there's an app there that is called Wait, Don't Fuck Her, She's Your Cousin. I don't know how that translates to Icelandic. If people have their DNA decode, this Icelandic company basically genotyped almost the whole country, and everyone has their own data, so they just, like, at a bar, literally, like, check their DNA. This is what I've heard. I've read about it. I haven't been.
Didn't happen on my field work in Iceland, just to be clear. I never showed that out.
Yeah, so,
Anyway, let's do 2 questions. And let's do 1 question. So go here and then.
Right. I want to bring up the case of wealthy families that pass habits and standards to their kids, through the business, running the business, to teach them good principles of management and respect for other people and all these nice things that benefit both the business and the society. So one example of that is the people who made Rheingold beer. They started out in the family name was Wheatland, and even back in 1820, Joseph Wheatland, the 7 generations back, was teaching. He was a sage for the people in the village. If they wanted to create a certain kind of business, they would come to him and he'd give them advice and stuff like that. And from that came, when they got to this country, 1854, they had habits to pass these down to the next generation. And when they, so it became the greatest beer maker of America, the most successful. And they had that standing in Europe. So how? One thing I can imagine in the future is that families will hold this information and use that as an input to this attempt to bring up responsible, successful people, both in the social sphere and in the business sphere.
Okay, hold on a second. Anna.
Thanks. For once, not a historical question, although I'm deep in writing a book and I have a chapter about Nazi racial science, what makes it objective and what doesn't. You gave an example with Metz Organics project about how we might have to rethink how we do sociological inquiry going forward. And I was wondering if you could give us maybe 2 or 3 more examples about where you see the biggest challenges to the way we do research in sociology.
Well, I'll try to answer both kind of the same way at the same time. So I think that there's no, I think you're talking about very important cultural transmission.
Yes.
Dynamic. And I'm not here to say that that's not important. In fact, I see Chris Dawes in the audience, and I forget if you're on the paper. You're on the paper that uses the Vietnam draft lottery to look at occupational inheritance. So we don't have a lot of natural experiments where a parent's occupation is randomly assigned to them, and in order to factor out genetics and then study the transmission. But Chris's paper shows that people who were randomly drafted in the Vietnam War era, their kids are more likely to enter the military too. So there's definitely, I'm not trying to say there's not pure cultural inheritance at all. I think that there's an interesting intertwining of cultural and genetic inheritance, and how that, I think what you're getting at, how parents try to build on the skills of their children, or I don't know this particular story of this beer dynasty, but like I'm sure there are a lot of offspring in many generations who were not selected to be the heir and carry on the business, and the ones that were, like, that there was some internal sort of differentiation among the kids at each generation, and then it was passed on to the one that seemed the most beer-like or whatever.
They were sorted out by role. In other words, some were mechanically inclined, they could run the machinery, and others were better at sales, and others in management. But they were, the parents were alert to who.
I think that's the interaction of nature and nurture right there, like you're talking about. And then remind me the upshot of your question that I lost.
Which would be different as sociologists.
Oh yeah, I think there's many ways that for one, finding exogenous, being aware that there's just genetic transmission and genetic, social genetic effects that are happening at the peer level and everything too, means that we need to just not ignore that and take it seriously, which means finding great natural experiments like Chris did for studying occupational inheritance, for example. So it's a challenge on that side, but it's also a really great tool, I think. So, in the age of big data, I think that genetics are different than other big data in the social sciences, but very useful. So, most big data, like looking at Google searches, great for knowing what people really think, not what they tell survey takers with social desirability bias, but what they really think when they think they're alone at night in their room and Google's not watching them. So it's most big data revealing effects, but I think genetics is really helpful with causes because I already mentioned that it's fixed at conception, it matters for most outcomes, and conditional on your parents, there's a natural experiment that's randomly assigned. So that three possibilities allows those three characteristics it makes a great tool for social scientists. So for example, the study that BK alluded to that's written in the book, we want to look at peer effects on smoking. It's really hard to disentangle who's smoking in a high school grade. But what we do is we use school fixed effects when we look at the random difference between this year's 10th grade and next year's 10th grade, or this year's 11th grade and next year's 11th grade within a given school. So all the sorting's already occurred, the only difference is just the random chance that this grade had a bunch, like a clique or 6 kids with really high genetic propensities to smoke, and this other grade only had 2 of those kids. And the ones with the 6 the whole grade is much more likely to smoke. It's like a genetic wildfire that spreads. That's a tool to study, not you can put it in the terms of metagenomics or social genomics, but it's just studying social contagion in a grade. It's a tool that I think is very useful for studying social effects. And you also mentioned the spousal effect, conditional on your own genome, like your spouse's genes for depression affect your mood and your depression likelihood about 1/3 as much as your own. And that's not some mysterious like pheromonal thing or whatever. It's probably through behavior. But we now have a way to separate out, because we can locate the causal origin to separate out how spouses affect each other, whether it's symmetrical or not. We can explore how kids affect their parents, how siblings affect each other. This sort of the part I'm most excited about for sociologists is the black box of the family to really understand causal pathways and social effects in the family. So I think it opens up a tool that social scientists can use. At the same time, it lays down a challenge that social scientists need to heed.
So Dalton, I haven't seen the DNA, but I'm pretty sure that you have the genetic predisposition for restlessness and curiosity. Well, the way I think about it is you married sociology early in life, and you kind of came by that for nurturing a great story. You tell us the story in your book of how you became a sociologist. We read about it in hockey also. Your parents kind of raised you in a science experiment, and you had this incredible exposure to a world that we were not born to experience. And so you embrace sociology, and you become this thing. But then, you can't get rid of the restless gene, and so there's a foray into economics and some time to policy and administration, and you found yourself in biology now. And so I love this quest, and it's incredibly productive, and you just every time you write something and you find a new area, you really challenge us to think differently. I went through a little bit of that today. And one of my, I also think that this like sociology part of you, the nurturing part of you, is really strong. And it's my prediction, I'm going to put it out here tonight, that eventually the sociology part is just going to kind of win over, and these other things are going to move over. And here's why I think this. So, BK talked about the problems with the PGI and how we think about its capacity to make predictions at the individual level, and the messiness that we get when we go from there to scaling up. And I was thinking about that as I read the book, and what it made me think about is the history of biological science attempting to explain human behavior and a range of outcomes with what always feels at the time like the best, most sophisticated, advanced scientific thinking. And it feels like every generation, including the eugenicists, were fairly certain that they had found the answer that the generation before them didn't have. And they felt comfortable making claims about what they'd be able to predict. And there's no doubt that we've advanced a lot. What you're doing is really different. I also just wonder if, like, 20, 30, 40 years from now, we might look back at this science and think, God, that was really a crude way to try to understand these human outcomes. And actually, the reason that so many historians of science are concerned about this area of inquiry and why maybe the Russell Sage Foundation walked away from it is because we've seen this story play out in the same pattern where the interest in biological determinism sorted by race, for instance, becomes so powerful that it swamps everything else. And so now we're in this moment where, I don't know if you've read about this Elon Musk guy, Doge, but like you have this kind of warning of what could happen if groups get a hold of this data, or now we have some regulations that restrict companies from discriminating in certain ways, but no one believes that that's going to last. It strikes me that of all the kinds of things that you raised, the kind of classic sociological policy concerns about what happens as this data enters into the public sphere, as it becomes an instrument for hiring, for sorting in education, for policy making, for insurance markets. Like, I feel uncertain about the predictive capacity of genetics to explain our personal outcomes, but I feel really certain that all that stuff, that's the specter of your book, is going to dominate our social policy conversations and get you back into this other sociology thing. So maybe that's just a long comment, but it feels to me like there is both in your book this kind of fascinating walk through where the science has taken us, and also this like the specter of the hard social policy problems that I know you care about also, and I'm just curious to know how you plan to engage in both of those fronts.
I really think this was two books struggling inside. One is like BK talked about more, which is how we have to think of genes and environment together. That's what the data show. I can give you more examples, like genes for smoking predict way more now than they did in 1950 because we made smoking much more difficult and costlier. So people who smoke now are really genetically hardwired to be addicted to nicotine. Genes for educational attainment predict way better now in women than they did in 1940 because higher education has opened up to women. So like, how do we even think about a genetic effect or an environmental effect is not independent of each other. That's kind of like the one side. Then it's just like, holy shit, there's these polygenic indices. No one's talking about them. They're on the horizon. They're here. And are we going to live in some weird dystopian future where schools are swapping kids and everything you talk about, Genome can fall away under a certain Congress. And that's an alarm bell because like if the polygenic score for education predicts at 20% now, if we in Thomas principle, if we act like it's 100% predictive, it will become 100% predictive because we'll just stratify based on that, and opportunities will be allocated. So that's a huge worry. But do I think that, and do I think that social scientists should not be doing this work? No, I think there's actually more reason social scientists should be at the table, because the data, these data were not developed by social scientists. They were developed by geneticists, and they're going to keep doing that. They're going to keep refining the scores.
So what do you make of the move, like when someone like an organization like Russell Sage says we're walking away from this, we won't touch this?
I think it's really dumb, because I was on the phone call with the board when they told us that. So I was on the Biosocial Science Advisory Group, and I even said, look, I can understand why you're walking away from the genetics part, but they also walked away from stuff like BK was talking about, where the environment, like examining how the environment affects health from a molecular level, or affects brain development. And they said, we simply cannot have a study associated with Russell Sage that says something like, poor kids' brains are smaller than rich kids' brains, or something. You know, that's a crude way of saying it. We're like, they just don't want to politically be, you know, even if it's all about poverty and opportunity affecting biology, they just didn't want to have it. I think that's short-sighted, because if they're not going to do it and they're not doing it the right way, someone else is still going to do it.
So Mike wants to weigh in, and then I'm going to let you respond, and then we're going to, Jeff, why don't we do Mike and Jeff, and you can respond, and then you can sign books.
Yeah, I'm not going to weigh in on Russell Sage, but on the broader question, I mean, we built the dichotomy, they built it. Our grandfathers built this dichotomy of nature and nurture because it was the immutable meets the mutable, and yet the whole lesson of the last 50 years of scholarship is that neither is immutable, so that now what we're dealing with are two moving parts, neither of which is fixed, and so we need to navigate instead of act like our grandfathers.
Nice frame. Jeff?
I want to flip Eric's question on its head. So if Franz Boas was sitting right here, would he be surprised? Like, obviously, he would be impressed with the complexity of the interaction that went beyond anything that the critics of racist science in 1911, when he wrote Primitives about the Mind of Primitive Man, would have thought of. But I'm wondering, like BK mentioned in the comments section, people are saying, we've known this for decades. What's the new story here? Could you kind of maybe just say a little bit more about what it is that is sort of fundamentally different from the earlier generation of critics of
I mean, I think two things are different. One is that we can measure the shadow now. We can measure the DNA. So that allows us to do a lot more than we could before, where we were just making educated guesses and partitioning effects. You can do a real gene-environment interaction study. You can really show how they mutually depend on each other, because you can put both of them on one side of the equation and multiply them together and see what happens. Like, we could not do that. So not even 20 years ago, let alone Franz Boas.
Right.
Like, and then I guess the second thing is just a greater appreciation for the gene-environment interaction effect, which again I didn't think I talked about enough here. That how genes matter is very conditional on the social environment, but also how the social environment matters is really conditional on someone's genetic predisposition. You know, why do some kids growing up in extreme poverty still manage to thrive, and some kids don't? I think explaining within group differences, genetics are very useful and very unuseful for explaining between group differences. That said, I think we're really at the infancy of this science, because to do gene-environment interactions studies the right way is the hardest thing, because you need randomized genetics, which requires good data with families, and you need a natural experiment on the environmental side. So I can probably count on one hand, maybe two, the number of gene-environment interaction studies, I believe, because you know, in the needs something like the Vietnam draft lottery, or needs something like random differences in the family, or some experiment, or a school reform like they did in the UK that extended mandatory schooling. Something to show that the environment is truly the environment and not the chosen environment for people's innate preferences, and then interact with genes. So so I think the science is actually at its start, not its.
So it's interesting. I mean, I think that the Boasians would have anticipated something like this. They didn't have the tools to measure it, and they were guessing, and they were, driven in part by the desire to criticize racist genetics. That was a big part of them. But their underlying kind of analysis sort of implied it in a way that's. So I'm just starting to read some of this stuff.
Yeah, that might be true.
You're welcome back in a few years when Jeff's done some more reading, and we can continue the conversation. So Dalton, thank you. I also really want to thank BK. We do a lot of events here, and that was one of the most thoughtful comments that we've seen here. So really appreciate this great.